Welcome back, everyone, to another in our series of COVID disruption sessions, learning about how to deal with teaching and doing research remotely. We're very fortunate today to have Chris Prather with us. She's the Arthur D. Little Professor of Chemical Engineering at MIT, and in that capacity, she's a highly noted researcher on topics like process engineering and biological synthesis, including topics that are highly relevant to energy, like synthesizing microbes that can participate in synthesizing biofuels. So maybe that's another topic that we could engage with her someday. But the topic for today is academic disruption. She is a fellow of the AAAS. She's what's known as a McVicker Fellow, a very prestigious position at MIT, recognize her contributions to teaching. She's the department executive officer, so she understands how things run. And she was recently head of what we call the CAP, the Committee on Academic Performance, which has this really important role in maintaining academic standards, dealing with students' problems in academic performance and setting policies. And so she's been strongly involved in all the different deliberations, including right now, very strongly involved in deciding what our grading policies will be. So let me hand over the meeting now to Professor Chris Prather.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Great, I see the nods. So I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna say a couple of things before I get started. One was that I actually participated or logged on to listen a couple of weeks ago and heard Tony Butera talk about how you can teach and learn mass transfer as you carried a casserole dish of hot cooked pasta from an apartment in Cambridge through the wintertime. Unfortunately, I don't think this presentation will be quite as hands-on exciting as that. But I hope what you'll see is that just the process of running the institution and making sure that we fulfill our core missions really did require a lot of rapid action and serious engagement across the Institute to keep things moving throughout this past spring. The second thing I want to say is I have this view now where I'm looking at my own screen, and so I can't see if there are hands being raised. I don't mind being interrupted at all. I usually say I have children, so I'm very much accustomed to being interrupted while I'm speaking. But I think it actually will make for a more informative discussion and conversation if we can do this in real time. So feel free to unmute yourself and just hop in at any moment if you want to make a comment or have any question about anything that we're talking about. So as Dan mentioned, this is Academic Regulations Under Disruptions. And I thought I would start by, let's see, there you go. By really sharing with you the timeline over which a lot of these changes were happening at MIT. So on February 1st of this year, the state of Massachusetts had its first confirmed case of COVID-19. What was interesting is that MIT was aware, as most of the world was aware, of COVID as a new illness caused by a novel coronavirus by then. MIT had issued guidance just a few days earlier in late January about travel to certain regions of China and wanting that travel to be recorded. There were no restrictions on travel at this point. There is awareness and concern about it. And I will say for my own purposes, when I saw that the first known case was a university student, it certainly became first and foremost in my mind, what will this actually mean for our educational institutions? That was 2 days before the first day of classes at MIT. So February 1st was a Saturday. On Monday the 3rd was the first day of classes. And I think even though, again, we'd had this case reported at that time, speaking for myself, I think the vast majority of us at faculty really had no idea what we were in for, even as we were somewhere in the backs of our minds aware of the fact that the world was probably going to change. It was about 4 weeks later when MIT as an institution announced its first COVID-related restrictions. So this was an email that was sent out to the community in the evening on a Thursday that said no international travel of any kind for faculty, staff, or students without exceptions, and the exceptions had to be given by the provost, so very high level exceptions. No K through 12 activities. So we have a number of activities on campus on a regular basis that involve our high school students and middle school students. Those were immediately canceled. And there was an immediate prohibition on large events. So as an example of a large event, every spring, all incoming or all admitted students who would be first year undergraduate students are invited for a campus preview weekend. And in this announcement, campus preview weekend was officially moved to a virtual event. I remember this date very clearly because I was scheduled to attend a conference in Portugal about 6 weeks later. And 1 hour before I got this email, I had been looking at airline tickets and remarked at how inexpensive they were to fly from Boston to the southern coast of Portugal. And perhaps that should have been my first sign that demand for air travel was shrinking quite rapidly. Only 4 days later, MIT sent out another email to the community. This was on Monday, March 9th, that said that there would be no in-person classes required for courses that had more than 150 students. It canceled any graduate visit weekends that had not already happened before. And quite importantly, although I think a lot of my colleagues missed it, I was involved early enough to know that this was very serious. It did say we need to get ready for remote teaching. And then 1 day later, on the 10th of March, our undergraduates were instructed of the need to depart campus by March 17th. So they were given 1 week to do this. Classes were announced to be canceled the week of March 13th. After that was a scheduled spring break, and we were informed that all teaching had to be remote starting on Monday, March 30th. Now, I'll note that at this point on March 10th, what was included actually in this notice for all of these changes was that Massachusetts had reported 41 confirmed or presumptive cases, which doesn't sound like a lot, but 3/4 of those were linked to a single event. So this was, again, another really strong signal to the community that we were dealing with a disease that was very infectious and a very high transmission rate, and that as a university, we had to prepare for that. 2 days after that, the timeline was accelerated. There was an announcement that there would be no classes at all on Friday, March 13th. And there was actually a request for undergraduate students to depart residences on an accelerated timeline. So students were told that if they could leave by the end of day on Sunday rather than the end of day on Thursday the 17th, that MIT would reimburse them up to $500 for any change fees or difference in airline fares that they may face in doing that. And I will say the quick pace at which our students actually packed up and left campus was entirely unprecedented. And within the space of less than a week, our undergraduate population had been reduced by more than 90%. We had the official declaration of a significant disruption on March 13th, beginning at 8:00 a.m. And so this coincided with the cancellation of classes for that day. And a significant disruption is officially defined within the rules and regulations of MIT. MIT is an institution which is known for faculty governance, which essentially means that there are rules and regulations about how the institute is managed, particularly when it comes to academic activities, academic calendars, the grading system, which Dan mentioned before. And those decisions are made by committees that are largely populated by faculty. The significant disruption provision there, though, recognizes that there may be a need to move more quickly under special circumstances than what can be done by going through the well-established channels for how to actually manage the institution. And I pull this out in terms of how a significant disruption is defined and what powers it gives in our rules and regs. So it does say that in the event of a significant disruption, and I put this in brackets, but what it actually says is the faculty operating through its officers and the chairs of the standing committees may impose temporary changes in the regulations. And it goes on to say what those changes may include, and it includes those things that I've just mentioned previously. And this is what I thought was very interesting, is that it does clearly state that the significant disruption could include, but is not limited to, an extended closure of the institute or suspension of classes due to a natural disaster, civil unrest, or pandemic illness. And so when I first saw this, I thought, wow, how prescient and all-knowing our founding fathers of MIT must have been. It actually turns out this is a relatively new provision in our rules and regs. So you may recall the previous coronavirus outbreak that drew a lot of attention was SARS in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004. And the faculty officers at that time thought about what would happen if there actually were a major outbreak of a pandemic illness. This does happen throughout human history. And they decided to actually rewrite the regulations to allow for the fact that there may be an emergency that would require the large-scale shift of students and or faculty or staff away from campus. And so one of the significance is actually of the fact that this was a relatively recent change to the regulations, is that those individuals who were involved in the deliberations about the structure of the language that would govern the disruption were still around. So we as a community were able to rely upon not just written histories, but actual conversations with individuals who were involved in those deliberations to really understand the spirit of them and what we should be doing and how we could do it and still be bound by what our governing principles are when it comes to faculty rules and regs. So this did lead to the establishment of emergency academic regulations. We refer to these as EARs. I'll say for this group, I was involved in email trains where they were described as temporary emergency academic regulations. And I thought tiers was much more appropriate for what many of us were experiencing at the time. But there was a little bit of concern about if we talked about too many tiers, then our students might actually feel even more stress and anxiety than they were under at the time. So they've never been referred to in any public documents as tiers. They are temporary EARs or just the EARs, the emergency academic regulations. So these officially canceled that week of classes. So there had to be an official declaration and a set of rules that went along with that. I think something that was important that was put in writing, but I'll say I'm not sure how many of my colleagues paid close attention to, was that the regulations also mandated that instructors account for the lost time by simply reducing the amount of material that they were delivering, and explicitly said, please do not accelerate your pace of teaching and try to cram a week of lost material into your classes. I'll say just as an aside, we live in Massachusetts. In the wintertime, we do have winter storms. And about 6 years ago now, there was a spring semester where we also lost the equivalent of a week of classes because of a series of storms that caused us to lose time. And so the loss of class teaching time is certainly not new for us, those of us who live in that area. But certainly having it done in this way and having it done as a full week of classes was a little bit different. The EARs formally require remote instruction. So it laid out the fact that all instruction had to be remote starting on Monday, March 30th, and talked about best practices for doing that, including establishing deadlines to provide revised syllabi to the students in classes. So if assignments were being changed as far as due dates or the scope of those assignments, we have a normal date that by the end of the third week of classes, that information has to be available to students. This established a new deadline that was about a week and a half after when we came back in the classes for telling students how things had changed. It also encouraged asynchronous modes of delivery. So we knew that as a university with students from all over the world, that our students would be going back to many different places as well. And I should point out that undergraduates were not asked to leave campus. They were encouraged, if they lived in on-campus housing, to depart if they could, but they did not have the same requirement to leave as our undergraduates did. And so our international population is much higher among our graduate students, but we do still have a significant number of international students for our undergraduate population. We also have 3 time zones just within the United States, 5 if you go all the way out to Hawaii. So we had students who were even still in the US, but who were quite a distance away as far as time zones were concerned. So this was a real recognition of that, and a request for instructors to think about not assuming that everyone would still be available at the same times that they had been available before. Okay, and so that meant to, whenever you were giving a Zoom lecture, to record that lecture and then make it available, or it could be pre-recorded and made available to students ahead of time. I saw a question in the chat about overcoming the reduced materials. So let's talk about that for a little bit. What most instructors did was just choose to either remove topics completely, and I can speak from my own experience in terms of when I had to deal with losing a full week of teaching classes for those disruptions I talked about before. So what I did in that case was to both eliminate a couple of topics, and these were actually more advanced topics. So we pride ourselves on MIT on teaching what everybody else teaches plus some. And so we know that there's actually lots of competent engineers out in the world. And so pulling back on some of the more advanced topics does not result in students who are incapable of being effective professionals, either if they are in industry or if they were continuing to graduate school. So that was the primary way to do it, which is to pull back on some of those topics. The harder part, though, when you have to think about reducing material, is that in losing a week of classes, what we also lost was a week of assessment. And so in one of our graduate classes, for example, that week where classes were canceled, they had been scheduled to have a midterm exam. And the cancellation applied to all academic exercises. So you could not actually have the instructor of one class come to me and say, well, the students are ready for it. We know how to do it remotely. Can we still give the exam? And there was an explicit prohibition against that. So they did have to move their exam. It also would mean for classes that didn't have an exam, you would lose a week to be able to test some material. So what most instructors could do in that case was just to shift a little bit what was being offered. It did require, in some cases, a reimagining of the back end of the syllabus to say, what do we think is most important and what can be avoided, for lack of a better word. But I think the other challenge here, and this is always a little bit of an issue whenever there's a break, which is you have some learning loss. So we see this a lot with our undergraduates. They come back for a week after spring break, and whatever you talked about the Thursday and Friday before, they have no memory of whatsoever. Maybe they're thinking about the Mediterranean and where they're going to go on spring break. We lost now 2 weeks and a day in between that time period. And so I think that was actually a bigger issue than the material itself, was the fact that there had to be some re-lecturing or reteaching of material from right before the disruption, because we had the double whammy, if you will, of losing the time, but also that time was the time right before classes were suspended was a time of very high anxiety and stress. So the attention spans of students and their ability to really be able to engage was not what it would have been under normal circumstances. So those are just a few comments on how faculty were able to deal with that. But I think the short answer is that absolutely there was less content that was delivered, and there were fewer topics that students were able to be exposed to this semester compared to in previous spring terms. Okay, so the other thing, or the thing that most people point to in terms of what the EARS did, was to actually mandate alternate grades for all classes for both graduate students and undergraduate students. And alternate grades are actually defined in our rules and regulations. It's essentially a pass, no record system. So if a student receives a passing grade, and passing grade here was defined as A through C, then what would show up on their transcript was a PE, which means a passing grade, but in the event of an emergency. And NE means that there is no record of the grade external to MIT. So on the transcript that a student would have that they would submit for graduate school, or if they're applying for a job, there would be no indication the student had ever been enrolled in that class. There is something that we refer to as a grade report, which is available to students and advisors internally, as well as to departmental administrators. And that record would show that the student had attempted the class and not passed it. On the graduate side, the EARS explicitly allowed for virtual thesis defenses. So this was something we spent a little bit of time talking about, but there wasn't really much debate, which is that the way the rules were written, a student to defend their thesis had to give an in-person presentation with the thesis committee, and it had to be open to the public. So we just shifted to explicitly allow for the fact that thesis defenses could be done virtually. This was not part of the EARS, but later there was follow-on guidance that also said that the physical copy of the thesis did not need to be delivered to the library, but instead they could be, a PDF version could be mailed by email to the libraries for the archives. And then most importantly, I think in terms of the emergency academic regulations, and this is where the work of the committee that Dan described for me came in, was that it did anticipate that we might need to make adjustments to how we would normally monitor the academic progress of students to make sure that everyone was able to continue to make adequate progress towards their degrees. So,
can I bring something up?
Go ahead, Dan.
To me, it's relevant to the last slide that under emergency academic regulations, only A, B, and C get converted to pass. And so a student who was trending toward a D in a course, their faculty member might have had to just submit a no record for them, in which case they wouldn't get credit for having taken the class. So that's, I think, an exception we had to deal with, without maybe recognizing it explicitly. The emergency grading system penalized certain students who would have otherwise at least gotten through a class and gave them instead a no record. So we had to fix that.
Yeah, it's a very important point. It was something, and I'll mention it a little bit later as well. It was especially acute for undergraduates. For graduate students, a D is catastrophic. So not having the ability to have a D on the transcript had no impact. For undergraduates, this is one of the things I mentioned where the benefit of having this be a relatively new provision in the rules and regs was that we were given insight into the conversation that happened in terms of defining what these alternate grades were. So the alternate grades were defined at the same time that the provision for significant disruption was added to rules and regs as well. And the argument there was actually that we currently have a system for our first year undergraduate students, where in the fall, they are under a similar PNR, as we call it, so a pass no record, where they have to earn an A, B, or C in order to receive credit for it. In the spring semester of the first year, they're under what we describe as ABC no record. So in the first year, a D grade is not passing at all. And so personally, I disagreed where the committee came up with this decision 17 years ago. They thought that in the case of an emergency, it was more appropriate to follow what were established practices and principles regarding the D grade as a non-passing grade for at least the first year students, rather than to redefine that. But it did have very real consequences, as Dan mentioned, and I'll bring that up. I think I have it in one of the slides, but if not, I certainly have it as something to state orally when we get to that point. So now we're in this period where everything is distributed. There were a series of working groups that were established across the Institute to really just try to figure out how do we keep things going in the midst of this disruption. And part of it was keep moving now, but also how do we transition more effectively when the disruption is over. There was some hope for students to be able to, or rather for us to eventually get back to this sense of normalcy. So the academic continuity working group was really tasked with how do we keep the educational mission going. This was led by our vice chancellor, and he created a series of groups within there, one of which was called Responding to Academic Exceptions and Dislocations. This was a subgroup of the Academic Continuity Working Group, and I have here on the slide what the charge was for that group. And I was asked to lead this group, which is why Dan invited me to talk to you today. So we described as our overarching goal to make sure that students were able to progress to degree. And we thought it was important not just to respond to emergencies that would arise, but to be able to identify potential risks and try to understand ahead of time if there was anything that might affect an entire cohort of students or a particular program in any kind of way. So I see a couple of other questions that came into the chat. One was about, was it optional for students to select between pass and letter grade? No, and that was done quite intentionally. There was a lot of thought about the so-called opt-in options, and in the spring, it was ultimately decided that it was much more equitable to have it be mandated pass no record. And I'll come back to that. I'll remember that, and I'll come back and mention that in the context of something else as well. And then the other question that came in is how to deal with courses with practice and experimental lab. So we actually have in our department in chemical engineering, our project lab happening at that same time, and everything had to go remote. For some of those projects, the instructors were able to figure out simple experiments that they could do at home, or I shouldn't call them simple experiments, experiments involving simple equipment that they could do at home. So one group, for example, were instructed to build solar stills. So they built small distillation units that were solar powered. Works great if you're in a part of the country that has a lot of sunlight, not so great if you're in the part that has a lot of cloud cover. There were some groups that had been able to collect enough data before they were required to leave campus that they could spend the second half working on analysis and simulation. And then others went to strictly computational simulation-based projects. So we certainly had a mixture within that. For one of our undergraduate chemistry labs, we have, it's taught in the Department of Chemistry, but we have a chemical engineering faculty member who's involved in that. She reported that they actually had staff to conduct the experiments and to record what they were conducting in terms of videos and then send those out to students to be able to show them what they could analyze. That, I should point out, was only available for a short period of time because very quickly, it's not in this timeline, but a week after students were required to leave campus, we were required to shut down our research labs as well. So they were able to anticipate that a little bit, and they had some things that were already recorded and available. And then for others, they used simulated data and really focused more on the analysis aspect for the hands-on part rather than the measurement or building aspect of it. I thought, let me check, was there one more question? So did we have to change our bylaws to use the alternate grades? We did not. They were actually in the grading system. And so there was a specific section that described them and actually described the conditions under which they might be used. So they referred to, in the event of a significant disruption, that the alternate grades could be used. They also importantly talked about the potential of alternate grades to be used if there were something like a pandemic illness, but it didn't require the large-scale movement of students and faculty off campus. So for example, if you actually had a single student in the class who had, let's say a student had gone to Wuhan early on and came back and had to quarantine, and the disease, now I'm just making things up, right? But if there were a disease that required the student to be physically absent from campus for an extended period of time, the way the regulations were written, they actually allowed for the grades to be applied to individual students. We chose to apply them to all students in all classes, but our bylaws in this case are actually quite flexible in terms of how those alternate grades can be used. I think that's important because, as Dan mentioned, we still haven't decided what the grading scheme will be for next fall. We hope to come to conclusion on that by the end of this week. But we really do have a tremendous amount of flexibility, both from how alternate grades are defined, and because there is that provision that essentially says, in the case of a significant disruption, you can do what's right. That's the way I've chosen to interpret it. It essentially removes any sort of restrictions and gives freedom to faculty officers, the chairs of the committees, and people who are deeply engaged in education to think about what are the right decisions to make and to not be bound by them, or not be prohibited rather from implementing them because you're bound by a set of restrictions that are just too onerous for the time period. So I can't stress enough how incredibly important it was that back in 2003 or 2004, I think maybe when they officially went into place, that there was a group of faculty, the chair of the faculty at the time, Stephen Hall, thought enough to say we should plan for this eventuality into the future, because it really has made a tremendous difference in terms of how we can operate in the current environment. Okay, so one thing we recognized immediately was that undergraduates and graduate students both were subject to the same stresses, but the way that their educational programs were structured were very different. And so our group, our AED group as we called it, was actually broken up into 3 different teams. We had a core team that had one lead from the undergraduate side, which was myself. There was a co-lead from the graduate side, which was a staff member, who is a staff member in our Office of Graduate Education. We had other chairs of the standing committees, and then we had the registrar and the faculty governance administrator. And so to the last point in the chat, the reason that we had this core team with the registrar and our governance administrator was to make sure that we actually knew what we could and couldn't do within the rules and regulations, but also importantly to tell us where to go if decisions actually needed to be made or anything needed to be changed. We then had a separate subgroup that dealt with undergraduate issues, and the members of that came from our standing committee that deals with undergraduate issues. When we had a group to deal with the graduate issues that included both representation from 2 different standing committees and additional input from the departments. And I'll explain the reason for that a little bit later. So these subgroups actually met on a weekly basis throughout the spring semester to identify issues, to resolve them if we could, and if we didn't quite know what to do, then the core team met roughly every 2 weeks where we could roll up issues to them and say, here's what we're faced with, here's what we think we want to do, who actually has the authority to approve that. So it turned out to be a pretty effective strategy in terms of making sure that we could both identify and then resolve issues that arose. One of the things I want to emphasize, at our core team meeting, we did this very early on. And this was information that was shared by Mary Callahan, who's our registrar, who had been in a working group, one of the other working groups dealing with all these academic issues. And she said they found it very helpful to start with a set of guiding principles. And these were the principles that she shared with us that we adopted as well. And the point here was to have principles so that when you are trying to respond, you actually know what it is that you value, you know what it is that you're trying to achieve, and all of your decisions can then be informed by what you have previously established to be as those things that are important to consider. So first and foremost, and I say this is consistently been true as we've talked about students, is equity, that we want all students to have the ability to make it through the academic programs, and we didn't want to unfairly benefit or disadvantage anyone as a result of the disruption. We also wanted to minimize financial penalties. So I'll just mention very briefly here, there are a number of deadlines that we have for things like getting on the degree list or filling out this form, that if you don't do them, there are financial penalties associated with them. They're relatively minor, but we did a lot of waiving of those penalties this spring because we knew that the students, a lot of their lateness in terms of these forms was not due to their own neglect, but rather as a result of what was happening with the pandemic. The need for clear communication was very important, and we actually heard this from the Vice Chancellor who chartered this committee, which is that he felt it was very important that we make as many decisions at the institute level as possible so that we minimize both confusion and the possibility that different groups would go off in radically different directions. And I added to that something that we discussed within our own group, that we also wanted to be transparent about information we were asking for, decisions that were being made, and how those decisions were being made. We wanted to minimize what people had to figure out, so try to provide as much details as possible. And this was consistent with our objective to try to anticipate what the challenges would be and then gather information and communicate that ahead of time rather than having programs or individuals run into problems and then try to figure out how to fix them on the back end. And then the last part was to keep the principles that currently exist around academic honesty, to recognize this principle of being one MIT with one academic calendar, one grading scheme. So we've got 5 different schools, plus now a College of Computing. We have numerous graduate programs and undergraduate programs. And unlike a lot of other institutions, we are all bound by the same rules and regulations and the same restrictions. And so if there's a program or a department or a school that wants to go in a different direction, they actually need to have permission in order to do something different. And that's a really important core principle of MIT that we have tried to maintain. So our undergraduate programs, there are a couple of key features here that made our structure of dealing with this disruption a little bit easier, actually, compared to our graduate programs, which is why I'm doing undergraduates first. The first is that all of our undergraduate programs have a common set of regulations. This includes what are known as our GIRs, our General Institute requirements. There are 17 of these subjects. They all have to have 48 units, which corresponds to roughly 4 to 5 classes of unrestricted electives. And then the department can specify an additional 132 to 150 electives on top of that. And there could be some overlap between the GIRs and the departmental requirements. Okay, so every student is subject to the same rules and regulations as far as what they need to follow for an undergraduate degree. We also have the standing committee, the CAP that Dan mentioned, that is really well positioned to determine as well as implement any new policies during the disruption. And the reason this is the case is that we have this established process that's fairly robust that could deal with most of the questions that were raised. So for example, there was a question in the chat about whether or not a student could choose between letter grades. So in principle, actually not in principle, in reality, we actually do have junior, senior PDF options, for example. So in theory, a student who, let's say if we had letter grades as the default, then a student could petition to say, well, I want to change this grade to be on pass, fail, rather than letter grades. And we've dealt with those petitions regularly, okay? In this case, we mandated alternate grades. And we did actually have one student who tried to submit a petition to say, well, I want to petition to have my course be graded with letter grades instead of the alternate grade. So I want an A, a B, or a C rather than having this PE designation. So that would ordinarily fall within the purview of CAP, but we had clearly established EARs, our emergency academic regulations, that said alternate grades are mandated for everyone under all circumstances. And so we put out on our website a notice that was a frequently asked questions, and we put on there as an example question, I really need a letter grade for med school. Can I petition to CAP to change that? The answer was no, you cannot. So the kinds of questions that we anticipated that students would have, we knew that we already had a process to be able to deal with them. And as long as we were abiding by our guiding principles, we would have an answer. The one exception there, and the thing that we worried about early on, was whether or not we might have large numbers of students who could not complete courses in their last semester of their senior year, and therefore might be in danger of not being able to graduate. And the CEP, it turns out, has a process already for what's known as a single deficiency degree to address cases where students may fall short. And we had a significant question and concern here about whether or not that would be enough given the scope and the scale of the disruption. So I'll explain to you in a couple slides how we dealt with that. So here's some examples of the kinds of issues that we had to deal with. Here's a student who petitions to add a class after the disruption. They say in their statement, well, I'm going home. I don't have all the clubs and other extracurricular activities I normally have. So I have lots of extra time to go back and review all the old material. And so I'd like to join this class, even though I'm joining it halfway through the semester and I've missed the first half of what happened. We had about 50 petitions like this, and we denied every last one of them. And we relied upon this guiding principle of equity. We thought that students should be nearly unfairly disadvantaged nor advantaged by the disruption. And the fact that we went to alternate grades meant that a C was just as good as an A. And we knew that there were students who would then say, well, I just need to get by. I need to get enough in order to get the grade. And in this case, the grade was this PE grade. And so I want to hop in the middle of the class. I thought what was interesting about those petitions is that in about a quarter of the cases, the instructor actually said, sure, no problem. I don't care that you're coming into the class halfway through. But we did have a significant number of instructors who said, no, I think the fact that class is halfway over means that you shouldn't be joining at this time. Just checking. Oh, okay. Dan answered the question in the chat. Another case that we had, and this is actually related to Dan's point on the letter grade of D, and it comes back to this single deficiency issue that I described, which is we have another student who's a senior. Because of COVID, they can't complete all of their courses required for graduation. Should we still allow them to graduate? So we did have these guidelines for single deficiency degree, which declared that upon recommendation of the home department, if a student was missing one class and only one class, and that class was a departmental requirement and not one of the General Institute requirements, that the department could then petition to CAP and say, we think the student should be allowed to graduate, and CAP could approve that person receiving their diploma. We actually had no idea what the scope of deficiencies might be. And so we had a really extensive process working with the departments as well as the instructors. We actually sent emails to every instructor who had a senior in their class and said, if the student who's a senior is in danger of failing, please alert the student, alert the undergraduate officer of that department, and alert the advisor to the fact that the student is at risk of failing. And that way the departments can determine whether or not a failure will prevent the student from meeting their degree requirements or not. It took us about 4 weeks all told to go through this pretty rigorous, actually 6 weeks if you count the initial consultation with the departments to say, will this work? And then sending out the emails, getting the responses, having the departments those responses for us, and then having us as a committee make a decision of how we would treat that. And ultimately what we found was that the existing process that we had was actually pretty robust. We found very few cases where it looked like more than one degree requirement would be missing. And those cases where there would be a lack of multiple, a loss of multiple requirements, there were other extenuating circumstances that went well beyond COVID. We did end up making one exception, which is that we allowed for the department to present a case where a student was missing one class, but that class was a GIR instead of a departmental requirement. However, when we actually had our end of our degree meeting, there were no cases that were presented in this situation. I want to mention one point here that Dan brought up, which is this unique case of the D grade. So we have a representative from the registrar's office on our committee who likes to say D stands for degree. And we actually had a student who was missing a degree requirement because the instructor said, I would normally give this student a D, but based on the emergency academic regulations, I can't. They've been assigned the NE, and that's CAP heard that case, and we approved that student as a single deficiency student because they were really caught in this circumstance of the alternate grades rather than having done something inappropriate or having not met their responsibilities as a degree candidate. Overall, we actually only ended up having to approve 3 of these single deficiency degrees, and the number of students who graduated was typical of what it would have been absent the disruption. The last thing I want to mention on undergraduates is that all of our undergraduate students are subject to review by CAP at the end of each academic semester. The actions that we take include academic probation, which we refer to as warning, as well as required academic leave. We did issue new guidelines to departments asking them to be more lenient. We thought it was really difficult to decouple academic issues that were COVID related versus other. And so we, as a result, had fewer students placed on academic warning for this semester. And for probably the first time in our history, we had no students who were placed on a required academic leave. So all of our students, even those who were in significant academic trouble, are being allowed to re-enroll in the fall and then hopefully improve their academic performance. For graduate programs, it's a very different scenario, and Dan knows this incredibly well. Our graduate programs are very diverse. They include master and doctoral programs for scientists and engineers, as well as a suite of professional master's programs like the MBA. We have a Master of Architecture degree, lots and lots of programs. And there's no single committee that actually has responsibility in the same way that the CAP does for undergraduate programs. So Dan is now the former chair of the Committee on Graduate Programs. There's a subcommittee of that committee called the Graduate Academic and Performance Group. And the Office of Graduate Education also actively engages in addressing issues with graduate students and graduate programs in a way that other staff offices or staffed offices don't do for undergraduates. So as a result of that, it meant that our subgroup had to be composed differently. So rather than just taking a group of people from one committee, we actually had members from those committees, but then reached out and had departmental representatives, both undergraduate officers and graduate administrators, as part of the group to actually help us to understand what the issues might be. That also meant that the approaches to identify and address issues had to be different because we couldn't rely on a single set of requirements for all of the different graduate programs. So our primary concern, what we ended up doing for this graduate subgroup was to really try to decide what were the issues that we might anticipate. So one of the things that we were concerned about was whether or not there were any issues as a result of the disruption that would result in entire cohorts being unable to complete their degree requirement. Okay? So an example here is one of the master's programs required internships. And the question was, well, will those internships be available? So we queried all the programs to say, are you concerned about being able to meet those requirements? None actually reported structural issues that were unresolved. For that one program that I mentioned for internships, they were able to place all of their students with virtual internships. But we did spend significant time discussing what would happen if that internship weren't available. And very importantly, this sort of came back to our core principles, because what we heard, and we talked about it with this core group who had very good awareness of the rules and regulations, were that you can't simply waive a degree requirement. You have to ask, why is it there? And what is the student missing if you say they no longer have to fulfill that requirement, okay? I mentioned this here because we are currently actively dealing with a program that does want to have a significant reduction in the degree requirements. But I think an important distinction in this case, and by the way, I should say, what we were told was it would be very unlikely that we would get approval to waive those internships, okay? We have another program that's looking at reducing requirements, but importantly, they are considering reducing the requirements for electives. Okay, so they've established a core set of courses and core set of activities that they think everyone should do. And then they have a requirement for a certain number of electives. And they're saying, we think the electives are not really constructive during the time there's all this disruption and access to the physical campus might be limited. But generally speaking, we didn't see any large-scale issues there. We did have a lot of questions that came up around qualifying exams, or what we refer to as our general exams, especially related to exams that had to be canceled because they were originally scheduled for the spring, or ones that had to be reformatted because we could no longer meet physically in person. And so we actually surveyed all the programs again to ask them what their plans were, if they had any concerns about this. We had what I'll describe as a modest response rate, about somewhere between a third and 40% of the departments responded. And we also considered reported concerns to OGE. So Students, when they're concerned, will typically go to the Office of Graduate Education to express those concerns. And so we knew from our representatives from OGE that students were communicating concerns about the qualifying exams as well. So this actually resulted in guidance being issued by the Vice Chancellor and the Senior Associate Dean for graduate students for how to manage qualifying exams during the disruption. And the most significant guidance from this is that the Vice Chancellor and Senior Dean advocated for what I'm describing here as a free failure for spring 2020. Okay, so roughly speaking, for most of the graduate programs, if you fail a qualifying exam, one additional time, and you have to progress through the degree. There was a strong feeling here that the disruption was so significant. I'm getting an unstable internet signal, so I'm going to turn off my video. We were had the feeling that the disruption was so significant that a student who might fail in that spring semester, it really shouldn't count against them. They were going to try to push through anyway, and they weren't really sure that they could, that we didn't want that to count. And we did not get any pushback from departments on that. I have to say, it's hard to know the extent to which departments exactly follow that because we don't ask for any sort of reporting requirements, as it were. But I did remind one department of it, and they said, I really appreciate the reminder. We'll definitely follow this. So generally speaking, programs and administrators were incredibly accommodating of the fact that these are really extraordinary circumstances. This is the last slide I have on these graduate issues, which is that the decentralized nature of our graduate programs means that what our group did here was actually offer fewer solutions. Instead, what we really were able to do was to identify issues that needed additional consideration. And we've been gathering information that we can share as best practices for other departments. The other thing that we've learned is that by having a group that could communicate directly with the graduate officers and administrators, they actually know that they at least have one group that they can contact if they have questions. And so what we've actually become is something of a clearinghouse where a program administrator, I've gotten emails that say, we want to be able to offer an exam and the student needs a quiet place to do this. Can you help? And because those of us on this committee are involved in so many other aspects of these continuity working groups, we're able to provide that necessary referral to other groups. And it may be these existing groups or even other groups on campus that are trying to help us to manage through this disruption. So I say that's a big difference here, where on the undergraduate side, that group is a subset of a committee. That committee acts with authority. It has very clear decision-making responsibility according to a really narrow set of requirements that everyone has. For the graduate programs, it has to be a much more collaborative and consensus-based approach. And I think it's working well, actually, to the extent that we are getting engagement from programs and we are finding that students are able to progress through the degree. I can see that I'm 5 minutes over, so I'll just very quickly say, I pulled this slide up yesterday. I keep thinking back to the fact that when we said everyone had to go home, we had 41 cases in the state of Massachusetts. Yesterday, and no deaths, by the way. Yesterday, we had confirmed almost 106,000 cases and more than 8,000 deaths. So this is really extraordinary in terms of the environment that we're in. And I have to say, I'm really very pleased that as an institution, we did keep our students first. We were very much committed to their progress. And I think we made a lot of very good decisions about how to support them while still making sure that they could get their degrees. So my final message here is that history tells us that global pandemics happen about once a century. This is just our time. I keep telling my undergraduates, imagine the stories you're going to tell your grandkids when they're whining and complaining, and you can say, oh, stop whining, I lived through a pandemic. I want to emphasize again that I think establishing guiding principles is a very effective way to engage in decision making. It really does help to center all of your decisions and deliberations around a broader set of goals and principles. And it allows a level of consistency in decisions that have to be made over time that I don't think can be done as effectively without establishing them up front. And then lastly, our purpose is education, but our purpose is also graduation. So we really were focused on what can we do to help students meet those goals and be able to actually earn their degrees. So I will stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions. And I see one in the chat. How can the disruption affect the procedure of quality assurance unit? Take care reviewing course file. Oh, quality of education is one. Okay, so let me comment on this one. So we have within the U.S. This ABET, this accreditation process, and for better or worse, the entire School of Engineering went through the ABET accreditation process this most recent academic year. So in the fall, actually, is when we had our site visits. I think in some ways it helped us, in some ways it hurt us. So the way in which it helped us is that process forces us to establish procedures for regular review. We have to have something called continuous improvement, for example, and regular assessment. And so we already had our systems in place to be able to monitor how we were actually responding. Now, importantly, though, we recognize that this disruption was really different. And so we actually did away with all of our standard surveys. For all of our classes across the Institute, at the end of each semester, there are evaluations where students rate the class, they rate the instructors as well, along a set of questions that have been asked the same way for decades since I was an undergraduate, and I graduated 26 years ago. And there are also specific questions that you can add to that survey as well. One of the things that we like to say is that the students were passed no record this semester, but the faculty were as well, and the instructors were. And so there was a really strong feeling that we did not want to burden instructors by being assessed under what were extraordinary circumstances where they had very little time to actually prepare to teach fully remote. So we do have assessments or evaluations from the spring semester they would normally be. And to be perfectly honest, our stance has been, we believe that the ABET process can be useful, but if we follow our guiding principles, our primary focus has to be on educating our students and allowing them to progress towards degree. So if we have a semester where we don't have the normal surveys that we have, we're just going to live with it. We're not going to be bothered by that. We're going to continue to learn as much as we can from what's happening now so that we can put better systems in place in the case of future disruptions. But we're not going to expect ourselves to achieve the same things that we could achieve being in person, in labs, in classrooms, and now asking most of our students to do the same thing remotely. They're not learning the same way, we're not teaching the same way, and so we don't expect that we're gonna have 100% achievement of the same learning objectives that we had prior to shifting this way. I hope that answered the question that was being posed. I see a hand that's raised from Tamara.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this interesting presentation. It gave me a lot of ideas. However, I have a question about your student information system or student registration system or student grading system. Mm-hmm. I guess all these changes and emergency grading criteria or regulations had to be reflected in your automated system. So can you say something about this in a bit more details? Because we are in the process now of doing this, and actually the head of the IT is really feeling bad about it. Because, yeah. And so can you please tell me more about this?
So I can comment on this. So MIT is a quirky place. For better or worse, most of our registrar systems where grades are recorded are actually homemade and internally built and monitored. Right? So that's good and bad. The bad part about it is that it makes it very difficult to interface with external platforms. So for example, it's ironic to think about this, but MIT was probably the last university in the country to go to online registration instead of paper registration. And it was simply because our back-end system was not well designed to interface with off-the-shelf software. And so they actually had to build new interfaces to be able to allow that. The advantage of it, though, is that it's entirely ours and entirely open to us. And so we actually have, quite a few IT professionals who work specifically with the registrar's office to be able to handle any of these sorts of challenges that exist. The last point, though, which is very important, is a critical one, which is that we used a grading system that had been previously designed and defined by our rules and regulations. So back in 2004, when the significant disruption clause was implemented and when the alternate grades were defined, the registrar's database had to be updated at that time to define those grades. So those grades were actually already in the system. They just had been invisible to instructors up until now. So it actually turns out, for the technology side of it, the transition for us was fairly simple, but it really was because of the fact that we have this database that we can deal with completely, that we can modify anytime we want. There's no firewalls or any sort of administrative restrictions or anything like that. So that's how we dealt with it. I mean, I think one comment I can make in terms of different grading systems is that if you look at, for example, the fact that our first year students in the first semester are already under this system, which is like a pass no record system. That's not what we ask instructors to report. Instructors still report letter grades, and those letter grades are then converted to the pass no record format. So those students still have internal grades. So I mentioned that because what I'm essentially saying is that it's a crude way to do it, but you could have, as far as the IT system is concerned, have a system where the instructors report what they've always reported, but then if you decide that there's an alternative interpretation of that you want made, it can happen on the back end rather than having to present a different interface to the instructors.
Okay, I just want to repeat something that you had mentioned, Chris. So it is the case that when we gave freshman grades, there was a hidden real letter, but under the emergency, there was no hidden grade. When we submitted, it was just P or NR or incomplete.
That is correct. So that was the difference, which is, and that's why I mentioned those options existed. Instructors never saw them. This semester, those are the only things that they saw. And Dan brings up a very good point, which I had neglected, which is that we do have an incomplete under normal circumstances, as most universities do. There's a special designation in the case of an emergency or significant disruption, which is an IE. So that's incomplete in the case of emergency. And the distinction between that and a normal incomplete is that for students who have incompletes on their transcripts, they have to be cleared before they're allowed to graduate. If the incomplete carries this emergency designation, it does not have to be cleared. So a student would not be prohibited from graduating if that incomplete were to remain on their transcript. Are there other questions? I'd be curious to know what you're doing at your university.
Crystal, I have actually a question and a comment.
Sure.
The comment is we haven't heard yet what will happen in the fall as far as grading is concerned. We did hear that it still has not been decided whether we will go to letter grades or the pass no record. But I also, we actually as a department heard that no matter what, we should not emphasize the grade in the fall. In other words, we should focus primarily on what the students would learn, irrespective of what the grade structure will be like, which kind of tells me that maybe we will go for the pass no record again, but I'm not sure. So my question to you is, do you know what sort of the thinking is now, and on what basis the decision might be made?
Yeah, so I know the thinking, but I can't tell you. Dan and I are sworn to secrecy until we actually make an announcement. I can tell you though the kinds of things that we're thinking about, because I think that's well known and it's helpful. So one of the ways that I think it's been most helpful for us as a committee to think about the grading system is to ask what is different and what is the same between what we anticipate to be the case in September when we start in the fall and what we know to have been the case this past spring. Okay? So things that are the same, there's still a pandemic. Here in the US, there are parts of the country where things are worse than they've ever been. I'm actually physically not in Massachusetts right now. My family is from Texas. And I'm visiting my mother in Texas, and every day I'm just dismayed by the way the numbers are rising in this part of the country. So we know that that the trends that I showed you before, where Massachusetts went from 51 to 104,000 in 4 months, that's happening in other parts of the country now. So we know that that's still the same. We know that a majority of our undergraduate students will be remote, so they will be at home or wherever. They won't be physically on campus. A majority of our graduate students we expect to be living in the Boston and Cambridge area, but a significant amount of their learning will also happen remotely. They'll have access to some in-person on-campus activities, but certainly not in the way that it's been before. And we know that there will continue to be significant stress and anxiety. So those are all things that we know are the same as what we expected in the spring. Things that are different, I do think, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to share the timeline. We went from a first case on February 1st to everyone go home in 5 weeks. The students were given 1 week notice to vacate campus that got shifted down to 5 days. And faculty were given the same notice. Faculty had 2 weeks to prepare to go to fully remote education or fully remote teaching. And one of those weeks was spring break, right? So no rest for us. we were immediately charged with using that time for educational preparation. We also know that the access to technology was very uneven for our students in the spring. But the same way that faculty now have more time to prepare, the Institute has had more time to make other arrangements available. So for example, we announced to our undergraduates that the university is securing iPads and Apple Pencils that can be loaned to anyone who doesn't have a tablet, so that they can actually write on a screen and have that be visible to a TA somewhere remotely. They can use software to actually share screens so that it looks like they're on the same whiteboard. So none of that was available to us in the spring. So we know that overall, the public health state might be the same, but the circumstances under which we have to do teaching and the resources that we can provide for students to do learning, that has changed. And so a lot of things are the same, a lot of things are different. And our challenge now, of course, is to figure out how do we balance the significance of one of those, one set of what's the same versus a set of things that have changed. And I should say have changed for the better, things that we know we can do better than we did before, and take that information and collectively try to arrive at a decision that still follows these guiding principles. I think Dan can confirm this as well. Equity has continued to be a major context for a lot of discussions and deliberations that we're having. And so we want to make sure that we're making a decision that we think is going to allow for that principle to be first and foremost in our minds.
So yeah, so actually, just to be sure, I wasn't asking for the decision. I wasn't asking you to spill the beans. I know you're sworn to secrecy, but I was asking about the thinking behind it, because that's basically what our partners may benefit from. Whatever decision we make is based on our own circumstances, and they have different circumstances. But I think that the thinking behind the decision and the process that led to the decision is more useful. But it sounds to me like whatever decision will be made or has been made, still based on accounting for the uncertainty. We don't know what will happen in the fall as far as the pandemic is concerned, and that this uncertainty should be factored into the decision.
Yes, and I think the other thing that is absolutely true is things could, whatever decision we make, it could change. I mean, we sent all of our students home. We're inviting all of our senior undergraduates back, along with students who can apply for exceptions because they're in difficult home learning environments. And so the best estimate is that we're going to have a occupancy of somewhere around 35 to 40%. Right? So again, half of what it normally would be, or less than half of what it normally would be. If this thing takes a sharp turn, and if in Massachusetts, we've done a great job in the state of Massachusetts of flattening the curve and keeping new infection rates really low. All of the metrics that the state follows are trending in the positive direction. That dashboard, I took a snapshot from it, but we track things like percent of positive cases, hospitalizations, deaths. All those metrics have dropped by anywhere from, the lowest number I saw was a drop of 84%, a high drop of 95% compared to April 15th, right? So we've really done a great job, but especially where we are in Boston, MIT is not the only university. MIT and Harvard aren't the only universities. There are many, many universities, most of which are planning to welcome a significant number of their students back. And if we start to see the kinds of behavior there among young people that I see on the news every day here in Texas amongst young people, it's quite possible that the public health situation could deteriorate in Massachusetts. And if that happens, then we have already declared a significant disruption. So there would not be a new declaration of a significant disruption. But because we're in a disruption, we are free to adjust and make changes to any of our emergency regulations as we go forward in response to whatever is happening. And I think that's also, it's very humbling, but it's very important for us to be very clear about the fact that we don't know what the future will hold. And we have to then have systems that allow us to adapt if we need to, because things are moving in the wrong direction.
Quick thing that I'll add to your very good response, Chris. Ahmed asked about principles that guide the thinking, and we can articulate a few. Certainly equity was high on our list. We're very concerned that students who are going home to a difficult learning environment, that they'll be treated fairly. Another is a maintenance of academic standards and movement as far as we can to something more like normal. To the extent that it's possible, we want to go toward a state that's more like normal as compared to spring, if that's feasible. We're putting a lot of emphasis on questions of stress and well-being of our students and our faculty. And we had inputs from student groups, but also from student support services and MIT Medical, so that we could make our decisions based on the best advice from those health professionals. We think that, it happens to be the case that 25% of MIT students are receiving some kind of mental health care. So things have changed quite a bit in that regard, and that number is only going up under this disruption.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point. And I want to emphasize what Dan just said, which is that we already know that even under what we thought were normal circumstances, our students have a tremendous amount of stress. And so, to be honest, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to alleviate all of that. But we're trying to be mindful of it and make decisions that we think will not make it worse. I see another hand, Tamara, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right or not, so please forgive me.
Perfect. You are very perfect in Arabic.
Thank you.
I would like to ask Dan, actually, I missed it. He said that a certain percentage of MIT students receive mental health care. How much was the percentage?
The number that I recall is 25%, which shocked me when I heard it. But if you include, even, care or some counseling that you get that might be not very severe, someone might be experiencing something mild, but still be getting care. The number comes up to about 1 in 4.
Come up to about?
It's about 25%, or about 1 out of 4 students.
1 out of 4,
getting,
yeah.
Getting some kind of professional medical care for mental health concerns.
And that's mainly out of stress?
No, it can be a range of things. It can include concern about something like dyslexia, ADHD.
But these are not really mental issues.
Right. So I should be careful. The MIT Medical told us that it was 25% that are receiving care for something they described as mental or emotional health. And I think that things like ADHD were included in that.
Okay. Do you have any
yes, excellent presentation. Oh, no.
Do you have any statistics about about the percentage before entering MIT?
No. Sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to hop in there. But I'll comment on this. I wanted to clarify as well that 25% number that Dan gave, that's for graduate and undergraduate students. So it's across the entire student population that the numbers are consistent. So it's not just that one group has more contact with mental health than the other. It's everyone. We don't have any statistics on beforehand. We cannot ask, and we do not ask. And so for the extent to which there are students who have continuing challenges from prior to they came to MIT versus anything that emerges while they're at MIT. MIT Medical may have some of that information, but that is not anything that they would ever make public.
And I don't know how it compares to other U.S. Higher education institutions. Those numbers sound high to me. They surprised me, but I think it's somewhat of a generational change that getting care for such matters is far less stigmatized than it was 20 years ago. So this may be more of a positive trend in that people who could benefit from some counseling are getting it.
Yeah, and I'll just comment to say I've seen articles. I have a very close friend who does counseling in higher education, and so I'm often forwarded articles that there was a sharp increase that dates back now to probably around 8 to 10 years ago. But this is a common trend being seen across universities in the U.S., especially as universities have struggled to have sufficient staff to be able to provide support for students who are requesting it. So it is. The other thing I will say, because I have been involved in discussions where I've heard this as a parent, to Dan's point, there is a generational aspect to it where I have heard counselors in younger grades, so for middle school students, for example, and high school students who've been doing this for decades, saying that they're seeing sharp increases, and younger students who are also dealing with stress and anxiety. So I say that to say I don't think it's relatively new across the course of academics, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. If you look back or look ahead towards students who are younger and will be coming in through the pipeline, this is something that we're going to be dealing with as universities for quite some time.
Just to give you a small short story, about 6 months ago, a student from an engineering student, not from Ain Shams, not from Mansoura, not from Aswan, but from Helwan University, he committed suicide. And in his suicide letter, he blamed the stress he's facing at the engineering education. And then lots of fingers were pointing at all of us, all engineering schools, that we are putting a lot of stress on our students. But now I have a figure that I can use that tell them that it's not only us in engineering schools here in Egypt, but it's indeed quite stress. But one thing about generation as well, that this generation, I don't know, but compared even going to or seeking professional help, I think students nowadays, or youngsters nowadays, are very easily stressed by small things. It was not as when I was a student. I think our generation was more solid against, disruptions or these kind of things. Even, I don't know if everyone feels the same as myself or not.
Excuse me, Tam, just a comment. He was not a student, he was a graduate from a faculty of engineering.
Yeah.
Slight difference. He was not enrolled in the study yet. He has completed his study and he was actually graduated about 1 year before this action.
Suicide rates are something we always keep a careful eye on because it's obviously tragic when it happens. So we watch those trends very carefully. And nationally there is a lot of discussion about both protecting the mental health of our youth and also building the resilience of our youth. So there's a lot of discussion about both topics.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why students are encouraged to seek mental health counseling is because there were a number of years where just about every year we had one suicide among the students. I forget how many years that was. Fortunately, I don't think we've had any over the past 2-3 years, but there was a number of years when every year we had one. So that brought to the fore the need to just provide the students with the opportunity to seek counseling and making sure that they understand that there's no stigma and no shame in seeking help if they need help.
I see a question in the chat about practical and oral exams.
I think I missed that one. Okay. So I don't think we have what are traditionally considered the practical exams. We have oral exams for qualifying exams, and those have been handled primarily by switching them to Zoom. But I'm actually going to ask Dan to answer this because I know that his department has oral exams for the qualifying exam. They did not offer them in the spring, but the next set, I believe, are scheduled to be offered in January. And I don't know that there's a decision that's been made, Dan, in terms of how you're planning to handle those. So maybe you can describe how those are typically done and maybe what you guys are thinking.
Sure. The way that they're typically done is that we have all the faculty participating. It's one of the few things that you cannot skip for any reason. You know, you can't go to a conference at that time. You can't be doing anything else at that time. And all of our qualifying exams are oral at this point. We used to have both written and oral, but we decided that only the oral part added really significant new information, given that people had already taken written exams in courses on the same subjects. So at this point, what happens is that we reserve rooms, we bring in panels of faculty for a wide range of subjects, actually a very long list of subjects that is including, you know, solid mechanics, control, probability, hydrodynamics, acoustics, optics. You know, think of how long the list would be of relevant subjects, and it's a long list. So students can elect to choose those subjects. They choose 4, and then they also do a research exam with a group of faculty who know that area. And they are given a question. They're allowed to sit and think and write about that question in a room for 20 minutes, I think it is now. And then they come in a room with the panel of faculty and they provide their answer and have a discussion with the faculty about their answer. And then we issue them a grade. And then we have a meeting to discuss the grades. So it's very intensive and it's right face to face. And I don't know whether we'll do it face to face this coming January when we administer our next qualifying exam. I thought probably we would have them face to face with social distancing and masks. Have you heard anything, Ahmed?
No, I don't think the decision has been made. I should just add that yesterday the department had a very long, 3.5, maybe 4-hour workshop on teaching in the fall, where different groups who are involved in teaching either analytical subjects or hands-on subjects or lab-based subjects organized presentations on thinking how all of this will be done in the fall. And it was actually very useful. People have been thinking and working during the summer to re-envision the whole process during the fall. It was very useful, and I couldn't attend all of it, so I cannot tell you all what went on, but maybe in a future time in the fall we can do one of those. But basically, the bottom line is that many of the lessons learned in the spring were updated, and people are thinking about all forms of refinement. The exam, there was discussions about the exams, and again, it's still under review. And I think one of the challenges is how to organize the teaching during the semester to de-emphasize the final exam in a significant way. So although I think compared to Egypt, we normally here de-emphasize the final exam. So final exams for undergraduate subjects are typically never given more than 40% of the total grade. The thinking now is that that's way too high in this mode of teaching. and we need to rethink the examination process so that it becomes much more distributed during the semester, so that the final may have maybe 20% or 25% instead of 40, and quizzes and micro exams and homeworks and things of that sort be given much more emphasis. That will ensure that the process is more fair, and also that the students are much more engaged during the semester, given that still it's going to be remote. I say that because it makes me think that, you know, thinking about the qualifying exam during this period may lead to, again, changing the format. I don't believe it has been decided, or or anybody has come up with a specific proposal of how to do it. But I'm inspired by the thinking around what we're going to do in the undergraduate, especially in the exam area. I mean, I think about it extensively. You know, how do you do exams in this format, and how do you do assessment, if you like, especially, you know, exam is one form of assessment, but assessment is much broader than the exam. And given that the whole enterprise has changed so much, definitely assessment has to change. And two things bother me constantly. One is, should we come up with one model for assessment and apply it across the whole institute or across the whole department, so it does not become arbitrary? Each faculty or each group of faculty have their own mode of assessment. So there's certain, you know, fairness issues. Or should we still be relying on the judgment of individual faculty and groups to come up with assessment strategy? And again, I think all of this still related to the qualifying, so I'm not answering Dan's question because I don't know the answer, but I'm just trying to think around it by going back to the whole question of why do we do examinations, and what exactly is the ultimate objective behind it. Is it just to give a grade, or to make sure that the students are learning? And if we're trying to make sure that the students are learning, should we do it differently, given that the instruction modality is very different? So this is still an ongoing discussion.
So I can add to that this is an active area of discussion at MIT as well. And I'll say, just as a point of information, under normal circumstances, you have to inform the registrar's office within the first 3 weeks of classes if you're planning to have a final exam at the end of the semester. And the final exam schedule is usually posted then 1 month into the new semester. When we actually had this shift to, with the disruption, where we shifted to fully remote learning and everyone was asked to leave, the departments got information to say, do you still want to offer your final exam? And the guidance that we got from our teaching and learning lab and Office of Digital Learning was that instructors should deprioritize these heavily weighted end of semester assessments, because the best thinking as far as people who study learning were that it was not really appropriate to do in more of a remote environment. And so I can speak in my own department. We had, for the spring semester, 2 graduate classes that are core classes that are always taught, 3 undergraduate classes that are core classes that are always taught. So 5 classes that always had final exams. And only one of those classes actually stuck to the final exam schedule. And it wasn't really a final exam, but they left it in that time slot because we have rules about when you can have your last assignment if you have an exam versus if you don't have an exam. So they would have lost a few instructional days if they had just made it not during final exam week. that is a continuing concern going into the fall. And honestly, I think your questions are good ones in the sense of how uniform or how much of a blanket policy should there be on how you actually do this. The MIT model for education and especially instruction has always been very individual. There's a lot of academic freedom, and we can agree as a department or as a unit on what the subjects are that should be taught, and we can agree on what the important material is, but exactly how that's done has always been left up to individual instructors outside of the very broad restrictions of dates and deadlines for various things that follow the academic calendar. So I think we, within this committee that's dealing with grades that Dan and I are on, we haven't yet gotten to the conversation about do we actually implement any sorts of regulations on things like assessment. One thing that was proposed is do we consider specifying what percentage of assignments have to be completed, let's say by Thanksgiving. So I should point out for the fall, we do have a shift in our academic calendar. So we're going to start classes a week earlier than usual. And then in the third week in November, we have our Thanksgiving break. Typically, classes are held Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of that week. Thursday and Friday is a holiday, and the students come back on Monday. Instead, that entire week will be an academic break. And our undergraduates who are living on campus at that time will all be asked to go back home to their residences, their permanent residences, and not return until February when our spring semester begins. And so there's a lot of thought about what's appropriate to have done before everyone is forced out again versus after. And so the question was raised, do we actually have now as a formal institute policy that some percentage, there was no number tossed out, but some percentage be done prior to that mid-fall break where everyone has to move out. We haven't started having those discussions, so I can't tell you how people feel about it, but I can't say it would represent a pretty significant departure from how we've always considered autonomy, for lack of a better word, and how various courses are taught. And so, you know, we don't have the answers either, but I think it's very helpful to hear your thoughts on how that's being discussed, because we have to have all these same conversations and make some decisions for ourselves going forward.
So that's a good opportunity for me to ask, for example, Ain Shams University, what has been your process and what are your decisions so far about academic regulations under disruption?
That's a very good question, actually. Yeah. I may try to summarize because the time is passing very rapidly. So if you allow me to share the screen, I may try to make a summary of the regulations for the postgraduate students, and then I will ask Dr. Tamer to complement and talk about the undergraduate student regulations. And certainly the undergraduate students regulations are the biggest part, actually, because they are the more problematic to handle. So I'll try to share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. This is one slide summary of all the main concepts in the regulations we have in Ain Shams University for the postgraduate study. First, the courses are all turned online starting from 15 March till the end of the semester, of course, because till now we don't have students allowed to come doing study in the campus. The exams for the postgraduate are scheduled from 15 August to 3 September, so we still have some time for the exams. And based on the regulations from the Supreme Council of Universities, all the exams will be written exams with 2 hour maximum for per exam. And I think this is the regulations not only for Ain Shams, maybe for all or the engineering universities in Egypt. For the thesis defense, either it's a Master of Science or a PhD, we have been allowing students to do their master defense and PhD defense, but only the student is present physically in campus with one or two of the committee members, such that we can say that we have a committee held in the university, and the rest of the committee members are online, could be online, so all the externals coming from different regions of the country and so on are all communicating online, asking their questions and so on. And there was no audience or audience online, so we don't allow audience to be. The maximum allowance was less than 10 persons in the whole of defense, actually. So no audience or a limited number of, very limited number of audience. Essentially, the student itself, himself or herself, with the committee members, and all the rest are online. Then the registration has been done online, but for some parts of the regulations, the students have been allowed to visit the university to ask for some papers. They don't go inside the university, except in very special cases and with masks and all the social precautions. But if they are asking for some special papers, they are necessary need of these papers, they can ask on the gate of the university, and they receive it on the gate also. So they are not allowed to penetrate inside the campus itself, but they can visit the campus in a very rare occasions. For the student, for regarding the time of the study itself, for example, we have for the students in the Master of Science, he has three years maximum. After that, he may have a prolongation of 1 year to have 3 years plus 1 to finish his Master of Science study. Then what we decided on the level of the university, that also starting from 15 March to say 15 July, which we could consider as a return to the normal study in the campus, all this period will be cut from the overall period allowed for the students to perform his study. So if he is in need of some extension with the study, we consider this period of time as if it's cut from all the study periods. Even so, working on this period on his own at home or things like that, but as the study is not done during this period in a perfect way, though we consider it as a cut from the overall allowed time of the study. And it's also considered as a period cut from any time-sensitive interactions, actually. Like what if you have, for example, the formation of the committee for the defense. So this formation of the committee of the defense has some limited time to execute and do the defense itself, the examination of the students. After that, it will be expired. This time is for 3 months, I think. They should have enough time to read, and they can ask for another 3 months as an extension if they need more time to read the thesis and judge the thesis. Here again, we consider also add the 3 or 4 months of COVID-19 interruptions as if they are cut from this allowed period. So if you study the formation of the committee of the judgment in first, should be starting their work in 1st of March, for example, they can continue another 3 months after the end of July, something like that. So as if we don't have these 3 months period within all the allowed time. If the student has also some time after his defense, he has, for example, 6 months maximum in our regulations to make all the necessary corrections in the thesis, either master thesis or PhD thesis. So it will be 6 months for the correction, plus also the 3 or 4 months of interruptions from 15 March till 15 July and so on, things like that. The rest of the study have been actually done online. So everything has been done online. The seminars for the qualifications, for registrations, all these seminars are all completely, are all done online. No restrictions on such seminars. For the lab work, if the students still have some lab work to do in his thesis, PhD or Master of Science, so it was allowed, under some restrictions, it was allowed for individual researchers actually to work in the lab, respecting all the social distancing and healthcare precautions required. So indications of everything, as a student working alone in his cube or with at least 2 meter distance between the workers in the labs. This was allowed with special permissions from the dean, faculty of engineering, for example, if he has the necessity to do some practical work during this period. So even when the school have been closed completely, some students have been allowed to go and continue their small practical work to complete their the rest of their work. I think this summarizes the maximum or the main rules that have been used during this period, and we are still applying these rules till now, until the end of the examination period, that will be in the 15th of September, the end of the year. Of the academic year is considered to be the end of the academic year of this academic year is considered to be 15 September actually. For the undergraduate students, the system has many more complications maybe. So I will ask Tamer to give some more details if you would like to add some more details, Tamer, about the regulations used for the undergraduate students at Shams University. Tamer, would you like to?
Yes.
Some details?
Actually, regarding the changes in regulations, it was not at Ain Shams University level. It was at the ministry level, or the Supreme. We have something called Supreme Council of Universities, and which regulates or puts the major regulations among all Egyptian universities. We have public universities and we have private universities. It's the minister who is heading the 2 councils, one for public universities and one for private universities. So all the regulations or changes in the regulation or emergency, I like the term emergency regulations, were mandated to us by the university, the ministry. Actually, it was a bit, we had a hard time because we didn't have our own decision about things, and when the first decree came out, of course there are lots of details and students are always asking a lot of questions, and then it was a lot of edits or additions to these emergency regulations. We also have 2 systems in our education system. One is the credit hour system, based on credit hours, and another one which is based on, we call it the semester-based system, which means that the student has to pass a certain number of courses in order to be promoted to the next level, from level to level. So that was another challenge, because you have 2 systems, 2 educational systems, and of course there are emergency regulations here and emergency regulations there. But luckily we are now getting rid of the semester-based system, and we are moving toward a fully credit hour system on our campus. In a nutshell, the regulations were divided into 2 parts. One part for the final year students, and another part for the non-final year students. For the final year students, they are of course, we continued, online education since the 15th of March. I guess it's the same as MIT and many other countries around the world. But the final year students, there are no changes regarding their regulations. They will not be touched. They will come on campus next week to take sit-in examinations, the same as before. The only change was that their education was online instead of face-to-face. For the non-final year students, it was pass and fail. So there were several options. If they have, they would submit a research or a project or whatever. So it was not a regular exam. So it was a design project or a research that they have to do, and then it was pass or fail. Pass or fail, yes, fail, it's different than MIT because they have no record, but we have fail. It is recorded as fail in his transcript, and he has to repeat it again next semester. Of course, I can understand when Christella talked about a lot of petitions from students, because students wanted to get advantage of this situation to their side. But one of the major decisions that we had, there will be no changes in student registrations, because it's the same. Students wanted to register more courses because they found it easy to study the course or pass the courses, because it's a pass and fail and the research or project that they do at home. We had even some students that they sent an excuse saying that they cannot take courses this semester because of medical situation, or they have to go and work or something. And then after the COVID-19, they came back and they said, okay, we want to withdraw our request and take the courses, but we said no to all the changes in registrations. Luckily, we are getting back to normal regulations. Speaking about the regulations, we are getting back to normal regulations starting actually this summer for the summer semester. That everything will be the same. Of course, the education will differ, either online, blended. Students have to come for some time and take the rest at home. I'm not talking here about the education, I'm talking about the regulations. So the regulations will be back to normal grading and normal everything. Of course, we have some leftover issues from previous, from spring 2020 semester, that because one of the regulations that the ministry mandated was that all, for example, in the credit hour system, that all students have to take the same number of courses or credit hour courses as pass and fail. And of course, when they have pass and fail, it's not counted in their GPA. So this means that according to the study plan of the program, which in our case, for example, is 17 credit hours. So if some students took 12 credit hours in spring 2020, they have to take 5 credit hours as pass and fail in summer or fall 2020. So we will still have leftovers, but hopefully all these fluctuations will die out by the end of fall 2020. Yeah, I guess this is a quick summary of the changes in the regulation side.
Would you say it's fair to describe it, Tamer, that actually you experienced a lot of the same issues and concerns that MIT did? There was actually a great deal of similarity.
Yes, yes, yes. I would say that, and also I like this petition part, because I'm in my position, Vice Dean for Education and Students. I get a lot of these petitions, so it's the same. They are trying to bend the system and bend the situation to their benefit. Well, I guess everyone would do the same if I don't know, but. Yeah, we try to keep fair opportunity for everyone.
It's a human nature, I think.
Yes. But the main difference between what I have seen at MIT and what happened at Ain Shams is that MIT had its own committee that decided on everything, and it was very close. That they know the situation. They got feedback from the departments. They got inputs from the department, so it was easy, the decision taking. And once a decision is taken, then it's easy to implement it because it's coming from the same place. But we were, the regulations came from the ministry, and there were other regulations from the university until us at the Faculty of Engineering. Yeah, it was tough.
Yeah, we tried actually to implement the same system, but it was quite difficult because we belong to a much heavier organizations. So the university itself is much more heavier, with 200,000 students, and the university should also be following the regulations coming from the Supreme of Council of Universities and the Ministry of Higher Education, which are much heavier organizations. So the regulations should be as general as possible and should be applicable for all the students from different natures, students of arts, students of law, students of engineering, students of medicine, all type of students, which makes quite difficult to be agile with such some circumstances, with such modification in the circumstances. But certainly what was quite interesting also is that we have been facing the same similar problems with MIT, and was also driven to think on the meaning of everything, the meaning of the assessment itself. Why should the assessment have this form or such form? So questions posed asked by Professor are quite in-depth questions. We are entertaining also all the time now. What is essential for the students to have, and how can we judge this know-how, these attitudes within the students. And they are actually questions legitimate for even beyond the COVID-19. So all for the improvement of all the educational systems in general. Because we are preparing our students for the market, and we would like to know what the best judgment for those students when they become engineers, when they are working in the market, what's really interesting and important for them, either as researchers or engineers or sales engineers or any type of functionality they are performing in the society. I believe that the questions posed and the answers and the discussions in such forum was very interesting, very enriching to improve our educational system, even beyond the COVID-19 disruptions.
Thank you, Dr. Dia. I noticed that we're, I think, at the end of our assigned time. So I want to say thank you to everyone for participating. And I also want to thank especially our speaker, Chris Prather. And I want to encourage you to please attend next week when we'll hear from the Teaching and Learning Lab about their perspectives on this remote learning and the research basis for their advice about how to do it well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the participants, and thank you, Dan, for governing such very interesting discussions.
Yeah, my pleasure.
For the effort you have done.
Very nice to virtually meet everyone.
It's our pleasure, actually.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, Chris.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day.
You
Dear
too.
Professor Christina. Excellent presentation, really. Yeah.
Thank you. We apologize, Dr. Rueda, we ran out of time. Next session, inshallah.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I enjoyed for Professor Christina about his presentations from MIT. Excellent presentation, covered many items for postgraduate, undergraduate, give more examples, students and student A, student B. Really more information that I'm learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all of you.
We also sorry for the presentation from Mansoura. Maybe we can handle that next time, inshallah.
Yes, okay. Doesn't matter.
Sure.
Thank you.